Now, just to show you my heart's in the right place, I'll give you my best pair of pajamas.
Hello? Hey, mister. How do you like my new pajamas?
I think they're very nice. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to my channel, Samantha Loves to Sew, where today we're going to be looking at the fascinating world of women's vintage pajamas. From the 1920s to the 1940s, women transitioned from traditional nightgowns to stylish, comfortable pajamas, influenced by iconic Hollywood movies and fashion pioneers like Coco Chanel. Pajamas became a symbol of modernity and practicality. Join me as we dive into the timeless charm of vintage pajamas and also reveal 4 pairs of vintage 1940s pajamas sewn from 4 different true vintage sewing patterns, 3 by myself and the other by the talented seamstress Jess Storey. Women began adopting pajamas in the 1920s and 30s, influenced by a desire for more practical and comfortable sleepwear, changing social norms that embraced a more relaxed lifestyle, and the avant-garde fashion icons they saw in the latest Hollywood movies. By the 1940s, there was also a trend towards women's equality. This encouraged the growing trend towards the wearing of pajamas. Hollywood movies in the 1920s, 30s and 40s often featured glamorous stars wearing pajamas, and one of the most famous was a wonderful movie. We recommend it, Claudette Colbert and It Happened One Night. There's a wonderful scene where Clark Gable lends her his pajamas and we see Claudette Colbert looking charmingly tomboyish, and other stars too of the era such as Irene Dunne showcase pajamas as chic and modern. Coco Chanel played a significant role in popularizing pajamas as fashionable loungewear for women. As early as the 1920s, she designed comfortable, stylish pajamas as leisure wear for women, breaking away from restrictive traditional clothing. And of course, the most glamorous of these 20s pajamas were made in silk and often in those distinctive Art Deco colors. Here I'm wearing a true vintage pair of 1920 silk pajamas in that very distinctive shade of Art Deco green. Wearing pajamas was considered quite avant-garde and was initially embraced by the more fashionable and progressive crowd, with some women, particularly in rural settings or perhaps older women, still wearing their nightgowns. It was the most fashionable women that led the way in adopting this new trend. By the 1940s, though, pajamas were becoming more acceptable for ordinary women too. The pajamas I'm wearing here are true vintage 1940s rayon pajamas. By the 40s, of course, silk was being used in the war effort for parachutes, etc. It was also less easy to obtain, so rayon was used in place of silk, and fabrics such as cotton and flannel became more popular for pajamas too by the 40s. And we can see, looking at sewing patterns, that the elegant, stylish patterns meant for lounging in the 20s and 30s started to become much more streamlined, tailored and practical by the 1940s. The practicality and comfort of pajamas appealed to many in the 1940s. So if you were in Britain and having to rush out to an air raid shelter, it was much easier and more covering. Dash to your air raid shelter in pajamas. By the 1940s, not just the fashionable avant-garde crowd in pajamas, we start seeing more ordinary women in pajamas, and sewing patterns of the era reflect that pajamas are now for those more ordinary women who subject to fabric rationing. So while in movies we still see stars like Katharine Hepburn, Rosalind Russell wearing wide-legged pajamas, which looked flowing and glamorous. For ordinary women with their fabric rationing, needing to put on their siren suit over the pajamas, the look was often more tailored with slightly slimmer legs. And we can see in these sewing patterns here how that more tailored look came in the 1940s. And one of the pairs of pajamas that I made up from this sewing pattern shows that more tailored look. The belted pajamas, which was quite typical in the 40s, where the look of pajamas mirrored fashion trends, the more masculine tailored fashion trends of the era. But I gave the pajamas a fun look with a novelty print of 40s showgirls. Now in the 40s, probably not have used a novelty print. Novelty prints came in the 1950s when fabric came off rationing. So a lot of novelty print pajamas by the 50s. By the 40s, truthfully, the fabrics would have been plainer or kind of small florals or plaids. So I went my own way a bit by doing these 40s pajamas. But the novelty print, which is by Tuppence Halfpenny on Spoonflower, I thought it was just fun because it was the 40s showgirls. It's a jersey fabric. I don't love stretch fabrics, to admit, but that's slightly wincier. Love that word, wincier. It has got that squodgy, stretchy quality, which is quite nice for pajamas, isn't it? In the 1940s, we have films like The Philadelphia Story and His Girl Friday popularizing the wearing of pajamas as a glamorous fashion choice. And the style of pajamas women wore in the Hollywood films was often used to say something about her personality. So in Bringing Up Baby, for example, Katharine Hepburn's pajama pants emphasised her quirky personality. Jean Harlow's pajamas emphasised her femme fatale glamour. In My Man Godfrey, which is what they called a screwball comedy of the time, Carole Lombard's bubbly and effervescent personality is emphasised by the fact that she wears pajamas.
Oh, you have a wonderful sense of humor. I wish I had a sense of humor, but I never can think of the right thing to say till everybody's gone home.
They share a sort of carefree and free-spirited persona. Hollywood used pajama scenes, such as the one in The Women of 1939, which I longed to show you clips of. It's copyrighted, but do find it. It's a treasure trove of fashion ideas if you love the late 30s, my favourite era. It's well worth watching. So while in the 20s, pajamas tended to reflect female personas that were avant-garde, stylish, femme fatale, perhaps a little decadent. By the 40s, they became more playful, more bold, independent women, a sort of symbol of modernity. By the 50s, of course, fabric rationing was lifted and pajamas became more decorative with more frills. And also there was a growing tendency from the 40s to the 50s for pajamas to become more playful. So by the 50s, we see pajamas with shorts, and of course there was a crossover to those wonderful play sets of the 40s and 50s, and definitely something that I'm going to be sewing this summer. And pajamas in these Hollywood films also allowed the stars in them to be not only glamorous but also relatable for ordinary women who could adopt this trend for stylish and comfortable pajamas too. So surprisingly, comfortable pajamas became a stylish, iconic form of sleepwear boosted by Hollywood, and especially roles played by women like Katharine Hepburn and Rosalind Russell that celebrated women as independent, intelligent, with careers. Personality was often enhanced by the wearing of pajamas in movies. Of course, something of that was always there. If we think about Marlene Dietrich in pajamas, her kind of untamed, independent spirit often enhanced by the wearing of pajamas. So by showcasing pajamas as fashionable and empowering, Hollywood cemented their role as an essential part of the modern women's wardrobe. So let's look now at some more sewing patterns and a pair of summer 40s pajamas sewn by Jess Storey from lovely vintage cotton. And we can see how that 40s fitted and tailored look where the pajamas are pretty and practical. And a lot of women actually started wearing their pajamas as alternative house coats. They were smart enough to be worn around the house. And I think Jess's summer 40s pajamas definitely show that. I wouldn't mind being surprised in those at any time of day. So a lovely, pretty, practical pair of 1940s pajamas that you'd be happy to be seen in. And I also sewed a pair of pretty cotton pajamas from a vintage cotton and an absolutely classic 1940s pattern that one of you, I'm sure will be watching, sent to me. So thank you so much for this wonderful vintage pattern, which I couldn't resist making up. And I know I shall be wearing a lot come the summertime. And I won't mind the postmen or couriers catching me in my pajamas when I'm wearing these. And you can see the classic 40s lines where the trousers, you say pants in America, not as full and swingy as the 30s. I mean, they're still quite wide. By our standards, they're still quite wide, but less full than the 30s. That slightly tailored, and the belt is a classic 40s touch, that smart belt that kind of ties in your waist, which we probably wouldn't have on pajamas today, but is a very 40s look. So while Hollywood made pajamas glamorous, in the UK in the 1940s, pajamas were often a matter of practicality. In winter, most homes were unheated. When sirens went off in the middle of the night, women had to leave their homes quickly. And if they didn't have a siren suit, they would just grab their coat or robe to fling on over their pajamas on the way to the air raid shelter. Pajamas were much more practical than nightgowns for wartime life, especially in the city. Two pairs of the pajamas that I sewed, I chose a more winceyette type fabric for winter because in the UK it is quite chilly for much of the year. So my showgirl pajamas that I've shown you have that tailored look with the belt. So even while there was fabric rationing and there tended to be less frills in wartime pajamas, you still do find sewing patterns with decorative frills. By the 50s, there were more frills, but in this 1940s sewing pattern that I made up, there were frills, and I felt like I hit a challenge that is very typical of the 40s in that I didn't have enough fabric for my pajamas. I bought the floral fabric at a vintage fabric fair, didn't have enough, so I had to supplement it with a little bit extra of the white fabric, which I colour blocked, and used the scraps of floral fabric that I had left to applicate 3 rabbits onto the back of the pajama top. And that would have been very typical in the 40s. Decorative trimmings using the fabric scraps that they had left. There are lots of needlecraft magazines with templates, etc. for motifs like those rabbits. So you'd use every scrap of fabric to make your pair of pajamas as decorative as possible, because of course they didn't have many clothes back then. The clothes that you had were precious. It wasn't like our throwaway society of today. Every garment you had counted, and you wanted it to be as practical, comfortable, and also as pretty and decorative as possible. And that was the spirit that I attempted to bring into this pair of kind of floral and bunny pajamas. In keeping with that theme, I used some very decorative buttons, actually, some decorative vintage buttons that I'll give you a little close-up of, but I also hand stitch the buttonholes in colours of threads that with colours picked out from the colours in the floral fabric. So each buttonhole a different colour, just to add that extra little decorative touch to my 40s pyjamas. And other ways that women might elevate their pyjamas to something prettier and more decorative might be the use of piping or perhaps embroidering a colour. They might monogram a pocket. There was lots of attention to detail in this era, which is why vintage sewing is such a passion. And really, entirely different to modern sewing because of that attention to detail. And the other thing I appreciate about these wartime 1940s pajama patterns is the practical design features. Elasticated waist, big roomy pockets, and of course the typical high waists of the era, which I like too. You don't want to draft on your lower back, do you? And button fronts were very popular, so you could just easily sort of do them up before you rushed out in the cold for an air raid. And of course pyjamas might be made from anything during wartime, in that fabric was rationed and scarce. With the fabric, your pyjamas might be made up from old sheets where parts of the sheet had holes in it. You might use the rest of the sheet to make up a pair of pyjamas. Old cotton curtains could become pyjamas. When the fabric wore out in a part of soft furnishing or closed fabric, around the worn out part was salvaged and sewn into something else. I think this thrift and ingenuity is what makes vintage sewing so appealing and also relevant today for sustainable sewing. If we ignore the dog, it is her walkies time. Nearly finished. With the British government encouraging women to make do and mend their clothes, pyjamas were no exception. So patterns encourage you to make the most of your fabric. Some women even made pyjamas with an eye to using the pyjama tops as blouses in the daytime. The sewing patterns of this era were produced with fabric rationing in mind, so that the cutting layouts made it easier to be efficient with the use of fabric. And of course, fabric prints, as you may know, in the 40s, they go in all directions. And that was also to mean that there was very little fabric wastage when you cut out your garment. This wasn't just practical, it was positively patriotic during the war. Something that you notice when you sew 1940s pajama patterns, the chorus girl pajamas come to mind. The legs wrap round, there's only one seam, and of course the fewer seams, the more you save on fabric. And so that would be a deliberate design choice. So we're going to play out by looking at the pajamas that Jess and I have sewn with the sewing patterns, and might be joined by a few furry friends. So thank you very much for watching, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.